explain what was taking place, of how the Holy Spirit came and filled people's lives, and suddenly they began speaking in tongues, and people were completely amazed at what was happening. So if you want to continue to kind of read through this, you can through the book of Acts and Acts chapter 2. But what really fascinates me is kind of the beginning of that story and then the end of the story. And that's really kind of where we're going to land here this morning. Because we've been doing this series called Connect. And we have been looking at the promise that Jesus gives to us, that he is with us always. And so what we've been doing is looking at how can we connect to Jesus in the midst of all of life. You know, whether we're at work, whether we're with family, whether we're doing recreation, whether we're going through just kind of some of the mundane things, how do we begin to connect with Jesus in the midst of all of life? And if Jesus is with us always, then the question that I sometimes ponder over, the question that I often get asked is, well, why do we bother coming to church? What's the point in coming together? And I think one of the great things that we do is when we explore our questions, to not simply kind of push them aside, but begin to ask that very question of why do we bother? Over the past number of months, probably even the last couple of years, I've been thinking and praying more and more over what is the purpose of the church? What is the purpose of this church? What is the purpose of my life? Because I think they're all kind of intertwined together. And for me, it's been kind of boiled down to this one statement, a statement that we're going to kind of look at these next 2 weeks. And I believe ultimately the purpose of the church is that we gather in order to scatter. That we gather in order to scatter. And what I want to do these next 2 weeks is look at that first aspect of gathering. Begin to understand, why is it important that we gather together? And then next week, hopefully if I've convinced you a little bit about the importance of gathering, you will come back, and then we'll talk about why we need to then scatter. But it's one of the questions that we ask, is why bother coming to church? I mean, we know that the church is more than simply the building in which we worship in from Sunday to Sunday. We know that the church is more than simply the programs and the ministries that we engage in. That ultimately the church are people who want to begin to seek God in the midst of life. It's the people. It's you and it's me. And there's different times when we come and we gather together. But one of the questions that we often face is, well, do we really need to come together? Like couldn't it simply be just kind of a me and Jesus sort of thing? It's been interesting to see the demographics of church change. 50 years ago, if someone were to ask you, what are you doing on a Sunday morning? Likely, if you gave an answer other than going to church, you'd get kind of a skewed look. Jump ahead 25 years, ask the same person the same question, and it would be kind of a toss-up. You could say, well, I'm not going to church, or I am going to church, I'm doing something else, and it would be kind of a neutral thing. They wouldn't think much of it if you weren't going, they wouldn't think much of it if you were going. Ask the same question today, what are you doing on a Sunday morning? And you say, well, I'm going to church. People would probably give you that same skewed look that they gave the person 50 years ago who said they weren't going to church. You're going to church. Why would you do that? What's the point? Like, why bother? And so as I thought about the church, as I thought about the importance of gathering together, I thought about what is an image that really kind of strikes a chord with me. And for me, I began to think of oxygen. I began to think of air. You see, so often we recognize that on a day-to-day basis, we're breathing and we're filling our lungs and we're just enjoying kind of this tremendous benefit. Do something with me here. Just humor me for a moment. What I want you to do is for the next 30 seconds, hold your breath. Ready? I got it on my watch here. Ready? Let me find the hand here. Ready? Hold your breath on 30 seconds. Ready? Go. Okay, if you can let it breath. That was like 20 seconds. I have a terrible lung capacity, but I wasn't going to make it, so I didn't want people falling over on me, and I got to still speak for a little bit while longer. But how many of you, before we did that little exercise, actually thought about the air that you breathe? You know, do you really sit there and, I don't know about you, but for me, days go by, weeks go by, months go by, that I don't really notice the reality that I am breathing. I just kind of take it for granted. But there's two things that can occur in my life that immediately allow me to notice the importance of oxygen. The first is pollution, bad air. You know, I can be going through life and things can be going well and I'll be breathing in, and then suddenly you walk into a place, maybe it is in a city where there's a lot of smog, there's a ton of humidity, or there's just this polluted air, and suddenly you notice that's bad air. And suddenly you think, oh, I don't want that air anymore. And you notice in your mind. You see, a lot of times I think the church is like bad air. You see, people often refer to the bad experiences that they have had. You know, we often don't, we say, well, I don't want to go to church because, I've experienced this or I've experienced that. You know, the statement that often gets made is, well, people in church, they're judgmental, they're hypocrites, they think they're better than me, and I don't go to church. I've experienced some bad air in my life, so I don't go to church. One of the interesting things about that is that's kind of expected, right? You got to expect to have some bad air in church because, let's be honest, it's filled with people like you and me, and we're not perfect. We mess up. We make mistakes. But if you experience bad air, it doesn't mean that suddenly you say, well, I'm no longer breathing ever again. I am done with this whole oxygen thing. Yet that's too often how we view church. Is we've had a bad experience. We've been hurt, we've been wounded, we've been judged, we've been disappointed. And suddenly we say, that's it. I'm done with it. I don't want it anymore. So sometimes we may have this kind of idealized version of the early church, right? Thinking that they had it all together. But if you read through the New Testament, so much of what Paul was talking about in his letters to the early churches was with the very specific issues that were going on. About how they had this inability to share. This ability to kind of bicker over different things. And Paul was constantly writing letters saying, listen, shape up. Like, this is not how we are called to live. Or you jump to the book of Revelation, the very first 3 chapters are 7 letters primarily that are written by Jesus. Written to 7 churches, saying, you have issues. You have things you need to deal with. You are giving off bad air that is causing people not to want to be a part of community anymore. And so one of the things we begin to see is because of the way we live, because of the way we act, we may begin to turn people off of something that is so necessary to living. One of the interesting things about community, about the church, is that we were hardwired to be together. And the reason I say that is if you begin to look at the example of, well, you know what, all I need is to kind of have this relationship with God, and then everything's going to be okay, it doesn't actually fit biblically. And it doesn't fit if you go all the way back to Genesis chapter 2, when you have God doing his creative handiwork and creating the heavens and the earth, and separating the land from the sea and putting the birds in the sky and the fish in the water. And after every day, God says, and it was good. And then one day, God decides to make man, to make Adam in his own image, far superior to anything else that he has created. And it's going to be God and Adam in the garden together. Think of how good that's going to be. But then God says, but it was not good. And it was not good because man was alone. And so he created Eve. And they began to live life together. And as you begin to read through the Old Testament, you see this emphasis placed upon community of just how God is building a community, and they had some things figured out, and they messed up more times than they figured it out, but they continued to grow and grow and grow. And then Jesus comes on the scene, and what's the first thing that he does? Is he begins to form a community around him and begins to teach them and begins to walk with them. You see, God's plans, God's intentions was that we would begin to live life together in community. Now, there's many things that we could talk about in terms of the importance of community, in terms of the importance of coming together and being a part of a church. But the second time that we notice that we need air, or we notice air, is when crisis begins to hit. Have you ever been with someone who is finding it difficult to breathe? Just almost gasping for breath? You begin to see just how vital, just how important air truly is. And I think one of the realities that we begin to see in terms of the importance of community, the importance of being in this together, is when difficult times begin to hit. When we go back to the passage that we just read, in Acts chapter 2, if you jump back even a little bit earlier into the Gospel of John, we see that at the time of Jesus' death, when Jesus had been crucified, he hadn't yet been raised, the disciples are freaking out. They don't know what is going to happen. They think that now that the Romans have kind of squashed Jesus, that now because they're followers of him, their time is next. And what did? They gathered together. Crisis had hit. So they began to spend time together. And then you carry that through into the book of Acts. And as they were waiting for this day of Pentecost, they're waiting for the Holy Spirit to come, they continued to gather and meet together. And then the Holy Spirit came, and we're told that 3,000 people were added to their numbers. But notice what the 3,000 people didn't do. They didn't say, awesome, fantastic, now we got the Holy Spirit, now we've got this relationship with God, you kind of do your thing, I'll do my thing, and we're going to be okay. No, it tells us that they continued to meet together in all kinds of places. They met in people's homes. They met in the temples. They broke bread together. They taught each other. They prayed with one another. They gave to each other. They shared their stuff with one another. Essentially, what began to happen was they lived life together. There's one of those words that sometimes as Christians we use that we kind of make a little bit too churchy, and it doesn't really resonate with people outside of faith in Jesus. And one of those words that I sometimes become uncomfortable with and don't often use is this word fellowship. Because fellowship so often just simply means, come and hang out and drink coffee with us after the service. That's really the extent of our fellowship. But fellowship is an amazing word when you go back to the original root of it, when Jesus' original followers were using it. And it's used in that passage in Acts chapter 2. It said, and they fellowshiped with one another. And fellowship really means a sense of partnership, a sense of participating in all of life together. And that's really one of the images that we see of the early church, of how they fellowshiped, how they participated, how they had partnership in the midst of all of life. You know, they went to the more formal places like the temple. But then they also hung out in each other's homes. They shared their possessions. They broke bread. They were willing to pray for one another. They were willing to teach each other. They essentially understood this reality of how they lived life together. You see, what's interesting is faith is more often caught than it is taught. You know, I could stand up here and tell you all the wonderful reasons as to why it is important to be in a sense of community together. But what we learn from the early church is clearly they caught something from Jesus. And what they caught was this reality that life is better lived together. As I thought of that question of why do we bother gathering together? Why do we bother doing it? I could talk about the ideas of, how when we pool our resources together, we can be more generous. I thought of how when we gather together, we can teach and we can learn together. I thought of how, when we gather together, there's this sense of being one. But what struck me the most is one of the greatest gifts of community is in times of crisis, of times when seemingly life begins to fall apart. As I thought of the Flat and the Bosma families, and I thought of the situations that they are going through these past number of weeks, just the hurt that's going to continue to carry on for weeks and months and potentially years. I was touched how in both places there was this underlying sense of community. The Bosma family had a strong connection with the CRC church at Ancaster. The Flat family obviously has a strong connection with Brant Community Church. And just hearing and seeing how these communities are coming together and truly understanding those words of Paul that says, you know what? When one weep, we all weep. And what I'm struck by is the reality is that so often we recognize our need for community in those difficult places. I know stories in this congregation. I know stories in my own life when suddenly difficulties and even tragedies begin to happen, and you see this rallying support of people coming together to offer support, to offer encouragement, to offer a sense of understanding. This must have been something that those earlier followers understood. It was something that surely Jesus talked about it and taught about, but ultimately it was something that was caught. When someone asks me, why do you bother going to church? Why do you bother being a pastor of a church? Because for me, community, life lived with others who want to seek Jesus is like air. It's something that I need to live. You know, Jesus talked about this abundant life. And I believe that one of the ways that we figure out this abundant life together is by living life together. Too often we can take things for granted. Too often we can only nitpick when we find things that we don't like. But when the floor begins to fall out beneath us, we begin to see how important community truly is. So what's the next step? I don't want to simply go away from this morning and think, yeah, I'm totally in. I understand this. Community is so important, and then do nothing about it. When I think of community, I think of family. And I think of family, you have different understandings, you have different rules, you have different traditions, things that you incorporate to make family better. For us, one thing that we did probably start of the year, so back in September, was we recognized, mornings are typically busy. It's typically get up, get fed, get dressed, and get out the door. And so Saturday mornings suddenly became a tradition of breakfast together. Some mornings we'd have like a breakfast sandwich. Some Saturdays we'd have waffles. I typically tried to push the direction of pancakes, but I'm outnumbered. I have more waffle lovers than pancake lovers. But we do breakfast together. No games, no toys, no phones. We do it together. And it's not this peaceful, let me not present it to you as this wonderful, peaceful thing that we're all sitting there, there's syrup in different places, other people are wanting to eat before others sit down. Some people want blueberries, others don't want blueberries. And there's times that I think, okay, forget it, we're never having another Saturday morning breakfast again. If this is how you're going to behave, no more pancakes, no more waffles, get yourself toast. Doesn't church sometimes feel like that a little bit? But we do it as a family. We make it a priority. And sometimes we take it for granted until a couple weeks ago, because of just the way life was going, we suddenly were unable to do it for a couple of Saturdays. And Rebecca and I were talking this week and says, wow, I've really missed our Saturday mornings together. So we had waffles on Saturday morning, much to my disappointment. My point is this. Sundays for me is like Saturday morning pancakes with the family. It's a thing that I value. It's a thing that is so important. Now, if I only had pancakes with my family one day a week, that wouldn't really be helpful. We interact at different times in different places. But it's a pretty good place to start. You see, community doesn't just simply happen. Families don't just simply happen. We have to be intentional. We have to put in time. We have to see the importance of the priority. And then it suddenly begins to grow and begins to develop and begins to become who we truly are. For me, Sunday morning is that opportunity for us to gather together, to celebrate, to give thanks, to be encouraged, to hopefully laugh together, sometimes cry together, but to be reminded that no matter what we're going through, we are in this together. We're in this together. And there's a tremendous amount of comfort and support. Sure, I admit on Sunday morning we have certain preferences. Some of you prefer to sing waffle songs. Other people prefer to sing pancake songs. Other people don't want waffles or pancakes at all in their songs. It's not so much about the preferences. It's about the reality of living life together. When people ask me, why do you bother with church? Because I couldn't imagine anything else. Because for me, it is such a valuable part of life. Life with you and life with God. Please stand as we sing together.